During her first months in California, Natalie faced a harsh and silent reality. She shared a tiny studio apartment with a classmate who snored like an old motorcycle and supported herself with 3 jobs: waitress in a coffee shop, proofreader for a professor, and, in the early hours of Friday mornings, receptionist at a 24-hour law firm. She slept in awkwardly spaced intervals between shifts, with dark circles under her eyes that seemed tattooed on her face. But in every stack of books she read on the subway, in every coffee served with trembling hands, throbbed a spark of something greater: the conviction that she was building a life of her own, far from her father's control. In her immediate surroundings, Natalie found small islands of affection that sustained her amidst the chaos. One of her professors, Dr. Ayala, welcomed her as a mentor and confidant, noticing from day one the intensity in her gaze and the rigidity with which she held her shoulders. In those eyes, she saw not only ambition, but also old wounds that had yet to heal. It was she who secured her an internship at a social justice organization that advocated for families affected by financial fraud during the 2008 crisis. There, surrounded by stories that resonated like echoes of her own childhood, Natalie began to feel there was a deeper reason for having endured so much silence for so many years. At 17, Natalie had accidentally found something she was never meant to see. One afternoon, while searching for an envelope in her father's office, she discovered an unlabeled gray folder hidden among accounting books. Inside were scanned contracts, international transfers, and printed emails from senders she didn't recognize, but whose last names she did: families ruined during the 2008 financial crisis. In the margins, Matthew's handwritten notes read more like confessions than calculations. The silence with which she closed that folder that day was the same one she would carry with her for years, as if she knew that opening her mouth could turn into a fire with no return. She kept that secret like someone hiding dynamite under the family room floor. Not out of fear of legal consequences, but because she knew that such information could destroy what little remained of her home. For years, listening to her father talk about financial ethics at executive dinners and watching her mother smile vacantly beside him, Natalie felt like she was in a poorly directed play. What saved her was her career, the debates in class, the certainty that sooner or later the moment to speak would come. She didn't know when or how, but she felt it coming like thunder before a storm. Graduation day arrived, shrouded in an emotional fog that Natalie couldn't immediately identify. She'd planned to attend alone without speeches or family dinners, convinced that her greatest achievement was having done it on her own. Yet, as soon as she stepped off the stage with her diploma in hand, she saw them. Her mother, standing next to Tyler and James, and behind them, like a statue carved with arrogance, Matthew Richards. They were dressed like they were for a corporate photo shoot, a clash with the California spontaneity surrounding the campus. Natalie felt her breath catch in her chest, not from excitement, but from confusion. What were they doing there? Why now? She accepted the dinner invitation with a mixture of bewilderment and resignation. The restaurant chosen was no coincidence. An elegant establishment with high ceilings and white tablecloths, where everyone seemed to be posing for someone. Matthew sat at the head of the table, as usual, and toasted with expensive wine to the family's sacrifice and individual success. Natalie clenched her jaw as her mother nodded like a cheerful ornament, and Tyler and James smiled as if the evening were merely a formality. She couldn't understand whether this was a reconciliation or a trap, but she would soon discover that her father hadn't traveled there to congratulate her, but to expose her. The dinner conversation was a choreography of appearances, carefully orchestrated by Matthew. Every word he spoke had the edge of a razor wrapped in velvet. He spoke of the family's future, of the Richards' legacy, and how some chose paths that led them away from true values. Natalie no longer ate. She stirred the mashed potatoes with her fork, feeling her insides harden to stone. She knew the speech had a name, and it was hers. Then, without warning, Matthew raised his voice and said, "Sometimes raising someone doesn't guarantee the person will deserve your last name. To me, Natalie stopped being a Richards the day she chose to betray what we stand for." The silence that followed was thick and sticky. The waiters pretended not to hear. Her mother looked away, as if unable to bear the weight of what she had just heard. James and Tyler glanced at each other, uncomfortable, but didn't say a word. Natalie felt something inside her, which she had bottled up for years, break. It wasn't just pain anymore. It was indignation, weariness, the tiredness of pretending there was still something left to rescue. In that instant, she didn't think about strategies or consequences. She only knew that the moment had arrived. The moment when the buried secret had to come to the surface, like a truth that no longer asked permission to be told. With a calmness that no one at the table immediately understood, Natalie placed her napkin on her plate and slowly sat up. She didn't raise her voice. There were no shouts or hysteria. Just one sentence delivered with surgical clarity. And what exactly does this family represent, Dad? The fraudulent investments of 2008? The deals with the three families who lost everything while you shielded your assets in Swiss accounts? Matthew's face contorted for a split second. He said nothing, but his pupils constricted, revealing the one thing he'd never shown in public: fear. Natalie, relentless, pulled a manila envelope from her purse and placed it on the table in front of him. If you want to talk about betrayal, at least be honest with the whole story. The room hung in a silence that not even the clinking of glasses could break. Diana, as white as the porcelain on her plate, seemed paralyzed. James put a hand to the back of his neck, as if all the air had suddenly evaporated. Tyler was the first to react, with a barely audible whisper. "What's that, Natalie?" She didn't respond. She just stared at her father, who still hadn't touched the envelope. Inside were copies of the documents she'd found years ago: bank statements, printed emails, handwritten notes. Everything carefully organized. This wasn't an impulsive scandal. This was justice long overdue. And that night, instead of celebrating her degree, Natalie chose, for the first time, to exercise the power her father had always denied her. Matthew didn't open the envelope. He didn't even touch it. He just leaned back in his chair as if he could impose control through silence, as he had done all his life. But this time, it didn't work. The air had changed, and not just at the table. The two women sitting at the next table, who had previously been chatting animatedly, now watched with uneasy attention. The passing waiter pretended to check the tray, but he was also listening. The scandal wasn't scandalous because of its volume, but because of its truth. It was a bomb that exploded not in shouts, but in truths that weighed tons. Matthew swallowed. His voice came out low, barely a murmur. "You have no idea what you're doing." "Yes, I do," Natalie replied without flinching. "I have copies of everything, and I also have contacts in the press. But don't worry, Dad. I didn't come to publicly ruin you tonight. I came to reclaim what you took from me, my dignity." Then she turned to her mother. "And you? Did you know all this, or did you just decide to look the other way for 20 years? Diana was trembling. Her lips moved, but no words came out. And for the first time in Natalie's life, she didn't feel sorry. She felt liberated. It was as if her own voice, the one that always felt small in the face of her father's empire, had finally reached the right volume. Tyler, who until that moment had been the most loyal to the father, lowered his gaze and slowly pushed back his chair. "I want to see those documents too," he murmured, breaking the silent pact of loyalty he had always maintained with Matthew. James, on the other hand, abruptly stood up and left the table without a word, his face flushed with rage or perhaps shame. The Richards family, which for years had functioned as a perfectly oiled machine of image, power, and silence, was beginning to unravel as quickly as Natalie was finally finding the center of her voice. The entire restaurant didn't understand the details, but the emotional weight of the table was impossible to ignore. Matthew tried to regain control with a phrase that usually worked in boardroom meetings. "This stays between us." But it was too late. Natalie stood up, picked up her bag, and said, "That's up to you, but if you want to keep pretending there are no consequences, this time it won't be so easy." She turned around without waiting for a reply. She didn't look back. She walked toward the exit with a dignity that no last name could bestow. That night, as she stepped out onto the street with the cold wind hitting her face, she didn't feel sadness. She felt relief. Because sometimes breaking up a family isn't an act of destruction, but of honest rebuilding. That same night, Natalie returned home not with a sense of loss, but with a new certainty. She was no longer a spectator of her own story. As she walked through the streets of San Francisco toward the apartment she shared with two roommates, she mentally reviewed every decision that had led her to that moment. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The tears had already been shed for years in silence, in libraries, in shared bathrooms, on never-returned phone calls. What she felt now was different, a harsh but firm peace, as if the background noise had finally ceased. The next day, the phone rang nonstop. First it was Tyler, asking to see the documents. Then there was an unexpected call from his mother, who said nothing at first, then breathed on the other end of the line as if carrying the weight of a lifetime. "I never had the courage," she finally said. "I know," Natalie replied without rancor. Then came an email from a journalist, whom years before she had discreetly helped with information on corruption cases. He had heard rumors about the scandal at Matthew's firm. He wanted to talk. Natalie didn't answer immediately. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't in a hurry. She was learning to measure her steps, not out of fear, but out of strategy. In less than a week, the investment firm where Matthew was CFO issued a terse statement announcing his early retirement. There were no press conferences or formal explanations, but in the Chicago financial world, everyone knew how to read between the lines. Rumors spread like wildfire. Suspicious transactions during the crisis, triangulation of funds, conflicts of interest. Natalie watched everything from afar, without intervening. She didn't need to. The truth, when stated precisely, has the ability to walk alone. Tyler, for his part, resigned from his position at the same firm. "I can't keep defending something I no longer believe in," he wrote in a text message. It was brief, but sincere. For the first time, his brother didn't seem like an echo of his father, but rather a voice of his own in the making. Diana was the last to move. 2 weeks passed without Natalie hearing from her until one morning she received an email notification, a request for legal separation initiated by her mother. There were no speeches or dramatic letters, just concrete, silent action, as if she'd finally understood that the only way to stop being invisible was to make her own decisions. Natalie didn't celebrate, but she did feel a strange tenderness imagining her mother standing in front of a lawyer, signing papers with trembling but determined hands. Maybe they would never be close. Maybe what fear and inaction had destroyed would never be rebuilt. But now, at least, the two of them existed outside the script Matthew had written. As the days passed, Natalie began to experience a form of freedom she'd never known before. It wasn't just about not being financially dependent on her father, but about breaking the cycle of silence that had always surrounded her family. She continued working at the social justice organization, now with more conviction than ever. The stories of families devastated by financial decisions made in glass-fronted offices were no longer abstract cases for her. They were echoes of her own story, told from a different angle. She became one of the most committed paralegals on the team and soon received an unexpected offer, a scholarship to pursue a master's degree at Yale, specializing in corporate law and financial ethics. Upon reading the email with the offer, Natalie didn't feel immediate euphoria. She closed her computer and sat silently at the kitchen table for a long time, holding a cup of cold coffee. She remembered her room in Evanston, the silent meals, the school awards that were never hung on the wall. She thought about how much she had changed without losing her essence. She accepted the offer that same night, not out of ambition, but out of consistency. Because after everything she'd been through, she knew her story had a greater purpose, to show that even the most corrupt environments can be challenged when someone dares to speak the truth. During her first month at Yale, Natalie felt like she was breathing a different air. It wasn't just the colder weather or the imposing architecture. It was an internal sensation, as if her body recognized that she had finally arrived at a place that didn't constantly demand justification. Her classmates were brilliant, yes, but also flawed, complex, vulnerable. She no longer carried the pressure of representing a family that had used her as a showcase or a warning. In her presentations, she spoke clearly and powerfully, as if each word was backed by the scars she no longer concealed. More than once, professors and colleagues approached her after class to ask how she had learned to look that way, firmly but without anger. Natalie didn't always know how to respond. Sometimes she simply smiled. Other times she said she'd had good mentors. But deep down, she knew that her most real education hadn't occurred in university classrooms, but in absences and silences, in the effort to build something with empty hands. One afternoon, while reviewing a case for a seminar, she received a letter in the mail. It was from Diana. It wasn't many words, just a page of neat handwriting. "I'm starting therapy. I don't know what I've become, but I want to know who I could become. Thank you for awakening something in me, even though it hurt." Natalie read it once, then again, and for the first time in years, she let the tears fall without resistance. That night, after reading her mother's letter, Natalie didn't do anything grand. She didn't call anyone. She didn't write back. She just went for a walk around campus, headphones in, listening to an old playlist she'd created her freshman year at Berkeley. Each song reminded her of a past version of herself, the one who studied while crying, the one who poured coffee with numb fingers, the one who secretly dreamed of a world where she didn't have to prove her worth to anyone. And in the middle of that walk, on a stone bench by a fountain, she understood something, that it wasn't the scandal or her father's fall or the family breakup that marked her victory. It was having survived all of that, without turning to stone. From that moment on, Natalie began to write, not out of academic necessity, but as a way to organize her soul. Short stories, reflections, fragments of memory disguised as fiction. At first, she didn't show anything to anyone, but over time she began to share her writing on online forums where others told their own stories of heartbreak and rebirth. She discovered that putting her experiences into words not only helped her, but also others who had never had the courage to speak out. For the first time, her voice, one that for years had been ignored in her own home, became a guide for others who were also searching for justice, meaning, or simply a little light. One of her stories, titled "Truth is Also Inherited," began to circulate beyond the small forum where she had published it. It was shared by a professor, then by a law blog, and finally reached an editor who contacted her with an unexpected proposal to compile her writings into a book. At first, Natalie hesitated. She didn't consider herself a writer, but the editor insisted, What you write isn't literature, it's testimony, and testimony changes entire narratives. She accepted, not out of vanity, but out of commitment. Every word she wrote was a way of honoring not only what she had experienced, but also those who never had the opportunity to tell it. While she was preparing the manuscript, she received another unexpected call. Tyler wanted to visit her. It had been months since they last spoke. They met at a coffee shop near campus, away from the corporate noise that used to surround every family gathering. Tyler was different, thinner, less rigid. He told her about his plans to open an independent financial consulting firm, based on transparency and education for vulnerable clients. I want to do things right, Nat. Not out of guilt, out of conviction. Natalie listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she simply nodded. They didn't need to talk about the past. Sometimes change is more noticeable in silences than in confessions. Over time, Natalie learned to reconcile herself with the idea that not all wounds heal perfectly. She never spoke to James again. Her father, she learned from others, had moved to another state and avoided any kind of public exposure. He didn't try to contact her, and she didn't feel the need either, not out of resentment, but because she'd realized that some absences aren't filled, they're simply accepted. Instead, she began to build a new relationship with her mother without demands or pre-established roles. Diana still had gray days, but she no longer hid behind designer dresses or prolonged silences. Now they talked about books, therapy, and how they really felt. Natalie's book was published a year later under the title Dear Silences. It wasn't a bestseller, but it found its place among students, activists, and above all among young people who also came from families where power and affection didn't coexist. At each presentation, Natalie spoke with humility, with that mix of confidence and vulnerability that only those who have endured the fire without becoming it possess. Her story was no longer hers alone. It had become part of something bigger, a thread in a network of voices that dared break packs of silence. And every time someone approached her to thank her for writing what they couldn't yet say, Natalie knew she had chosen well. In an interview for a college magazine, Natalie was asked what the most defining moment of her life had been. She didn't mention graduation, the book, or even the confrontation with her father. She thought for a moment and replied, "It was when I decided not to keep silent anymore. That day, even though it seemed like I was losing everything, I won myself over." The quote went viral, but for her it wasn't a heroic act, but rather an inevitable consequence. Because when the truth takes root in the body for so many years, there comes a point where it can no longer be bottled up without breaking you from within. Natalie didn't speak to destroy. She spoke to rebuild herself. And in that process, without seeking it, she helped others begin their own. Today, Natalie continues her path as a lawyer and writer. She alternates between cases defending victims of corporate corruption and writing workshops for young people in difficult situations. She doesn't idealize the past, but she doesn't deny it either. She carries it with her like a scar that no longer hurts, but that she remembers. Sometimes she dreams of the house in Evanston, of the silent dinners, of her mother smiling soullessly. But when she wakes up, she takes a deep breath, stands up, and writes. Because now she knows that her voice not only has weight, it has direction. And with it, she walks. Although her life seemed on track, Natalie discovered that consistency wasn't a straight line. A year after the book's publication, she was invited to join an ethics advisory committee for an international firm seeking to rehabilitate its image after a series of financial scandals. The offer included a generous salary, professional visibility, and resources for her social projects. But when she received the company's background report, she recognized names, old names. Some, she said, had even worked side by side with her father. For days, she couldn't sleep well. She struggled between the desire to transform the system from within and the fear of becoming what she had sworn never to be, part of the machinery she had once denounced. Finally, she decided to meet with the executives. She entered the room with the same poise she'd once used to confront her father and laid out the conditions. She wouldn't accept being a face or whitewashing other people's guilt. If they wanted to work with her, it would be under transparent terms, with public audits and complete autonomy in her role. There was awkwardness, murmurs. Someone even laughed nervously, but as she left that meeting, they offered her the position on her terms. Natalie didn't see it as a personal victory, but as a symptom of a larger change. The system, though slow and resistant, could begin to buckle if someone pushed from the right place. Over time, her name began to circulate in circles that would have previously seemed impossible. She was invited to international panels on transparency, interviewed by media outlets that previously ignored young lawyers without resonant surnames. But what moved her most were the emails she received from students, many of them women, who wrote to her from remote corners of the country. "Your story gave me the courage to speak out. After reading your story, I decided to report it. Thank you for showing that we are not alone." Those messages, more than any award or mention, were her fuel. Each one represented a life that refused to remain silent any longer. Still, Natalie didn't idealize her journey. She knew the exposure came at a price. She'd received veiled threats, misogynistic comments disguised as professional criticism, and anonymous attacks on social media that tried to delegitimize her for being too emotional or objective. But they no longer broke her. She'd learned to recognize these attacks for what they were, desperate attempts to preserve an order that felt threatened. And if her very existence was so unsettling, it meant she was touching real nerves. Natalie wasn't looking to be an icon, she just wanted to be consistent. And in a world where that was already revolutionary, remaining steadfast in her values was, in itself, an act of resistance. On one of her brief returns to Chicago for a conference, Natalie walked past the old house in Evanston. She didn't stop. She just watched it from the opposite sidewalk, the cold wind flushing her cheeks. The curtains were still as perfectly aligned as they had been in her childhood, but now they seemed like part of an empty set. She didn't feel nostalgia or anger, just a clear distance, like someone looking at an old photo and realizing it belongs to another chapter. That house was no longer a symbol of power, but an encapsulated memory. She owed nothing to those walls, and for the first time, she didn't feel like they owed her anything either. Back at the hotel, she wrote in her diary something she hadn't verbalized until then. My father denied me, but in doing so, he unwittingly gave me the greatest gift, the opportunity to define myself without him. That phrase echoed in her ear all night, like an involuntary mantra. She jotted it down on a loose sheet of paper and put it in her wallet. On days of doubt, she took it out and read it quietly, like an anchor. Because although the path she'd traveled hadn't been easy, she wouldn't change it either. In every stone, in every crevice, she'd found a part of herself she hadn't even known existed. A year after that visit to Chicago, she received an unexpected invitation to give a commencement address for the new law students at UC Berkeley. At first, she hesitated, not because of stage fright. She had spoken before packed auditoriums before, but because returning to that campus triggered intense memories. The sleepless nights, the lonely walks, the days when she doubted herself. Still, she accepted. And when she took the stage in the main auditorium, she didn't speak from success or accomplishments. She spoke from the mud. She recounted how she'd been disinherited, how she carried trays and documents, how the family silence weighed more than any debt. And she told the students something that wasn't in the books. Sometimes what's right isn't what we're taught, but what we choose to stand up for when all else falls. After the event, a student approached her with shining eyes and said, I too come from a family where I don't fit in. I thought I had to become someone else, but now I understand that I don't. Natalie hugged him, saying nothing. In that gesture, she understood the true reach of her voice. She wasn't changing the world from the bench, but from the stories she chose to tell. And although justice remained a field filled with gray areas, she knew her compass was no longer shaky. It was firm, because it wasn't about saving everyone, but about not betraying herself in the attempt. As time passed, Natalie stopped measuring her success in titles or recognition. She began to measure it in questions she hadn't dared to ask before. Am I at peace with what I do? Am I being true to what I believe, even when no one is watching? She discovered that often true justice doesn't take the form of a ruling or celebrated in grand courtrooms. Sometimes it's more subtle, an honest conversation, a well-timed no, a letter written without waiting for a reply. Justice is also built in the invisible, and that, for her, was the quietest and most powerful revolution. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, she still thought about her father, not with hatred, but with a strange mix of compassion and distance. She knew he had chosen a path that couldn't be sustained without lies. And although his decisions had shaped many lives, Natalie no longer carried the burden of changing him. She had understood that not all stories have redemption, and that letting go is also a way of healing. There was never reconciliation, and that was okay, because not all scars need to be healed with a hug. Some are simply accepted and become part of the inner landscape. Today, Natalie continues to walk with firm steps. Not perfect, not invulnerable, but authentic. Each day is a construction, a renewed decision to be faithful to that young woman who once spoke out in front of her entire family and chose truth over fear. She no longer needs to prove anything, not to her father, not to the system, not to the world, only to herself. And in that daily act of silent integrity, she finds what she sought everywhere for years, belonging.